Narratives known as future narratives can be found everywhere, in books, in television shows, films, and even video games. This video essay will look at 3 different texts to figure out how this future narrative aspect can look like in practice by looking at Russian Doll Season 1, in which a woman called Nadia finds herself stuck in a time loop, the novel 4321 by Paul Auster, a story about 4 different versions of the same boy called Archie Ferguson, and the video game The Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe, which is a walking simulator which informs the player through a narrator that they are Stanley, also known as employee number 427, who works in an office pushing random buttons, which appear on his screen, until one day Stanley realizes that every single one of his co-workers had disappeared, and tries to figure out how this has happened by exploring the office space. I will try to figure out if The Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe can be seen as a future narrative by comparing it with Russian Doll Season 1 and the novel 4321. Now, before we start, we need to figure out what exactly future narratives are. Future narratives present the future as open and undecided, with multiple possibilities, just like real life. There are 2 different types of future narratives: time loops and the forking paths, which differ in focalization. In time loop narratives, one person is the focalizer who can learn from the previous rounds in the time loop and make different choices accordingly, whereas in the forking paths narrative, the person is not aware of the repetition. 2 of the chosen media examples, Russian Doll and the Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe, are using time loops or at least time loop adjacent elements to propel their story forward. The difference between the narrative structure is going to be explored to figure out if the Stanley Parable is actually a time loop narrative like Russian Doll, or if it's rather a forking paths narrative like 4321, in which the protagonist, Archie Ferguson, is not aware of any repetition. According to Posner, time loop narratives are a trope or subgenre wherein a circular temporality occurs on the diegetic level. A character in the narrative experiences a deviation from linear time, and instead of moving forward, they are trapped in a specific time span, which repeats over and over again. This entrapment can clearly be seen in Russian Doll Season 1, as Nadia is dying over and over again on her 36th birthday, and is trying to find a way out of this predicament by changing up her routine and her choices. The series uses different elements to let the viewer know the character is stuck in this time loop. After every death sequence, Nadia is standing in the bathroom, looking in the mirror, while the same music is playing, Gotta Get Up by Harry Nilsson. This element of restarting is also found in the Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe, as after reaching an ending, the game does not end, and lead the player back to the starting page of the game. Instead of credits rolling, a black screen appears with text on the bottom which says, "The end is never the end, is never the end, is never the end." And a loading symbol appears until the screen shows Stanley finding himself back in the office, trying to find his missing co-workers. And the clock also shows the same time as in the beginning. This reminds of the myth of Sisyphus, in which Camus compares the absurdity of the never-ending struggle of Sisyphus with the life of workers who work every day, performing the same tasks over and over again. Stanley / the player finds themselves in the same position, trying to find their lost co-workers, never being able to escape their predicament and finish the game, or find their co-workers, as the game will not allow it. This is a bit different compared to Russian Doll, as Nadia actually manages to break out of the time loop with the help of Allan, who is also stuck in the same loop as her. However, the first few episodes of Russian Doll also remind of the myth of Sisyphus, as Nadia tries to escape the time loop repeatedly. Another differing aspect of this time loop conundrum would be that death does not have to be the reason which resets Stanley in his office, but in Nadia's and Allan's case, it always is. Another element which is similar to the time loop aspect in Russian Doll is the fact that the world of Russian Doll does not stay identical with every reiteration of the loop, as fish are disappearing and fruits can start to rot, and even furniture and people disappear. In the Stanley Parable Ultra Deluxe, this is shown a bit differently, as the narrator has a bit of control over the game space and can change parts if he wants to, which is perhaps best illustrated by the broom closet ending and subsequent loops. In the broom closet ending, the player is just standing in the broom closet, found somewhere in the office space, which baffles the narrator, as nothing of interest can be found in that closet. If the player chooses to enter the broom closet again in the second loop, the narrator remarks upon the fact that Stanley already went in there and just sighs in disbelief. After the second time entering the closet, the next loops depict the broom closet as nailed shut, presumably by the narrator, because he does not want to deal with Stanley's/the player's antics anymore. So not only does Stanley always start in the same place, his office, just like Nadia in the bathroom, the environment also does not stay the same in both media. The first time Stanley is in the broom closet, the narrator also mentions,
"Maybe to you this is somehow its own branching path."
This alludes to the game possibly being a forking paths narrative like 4321. According to Cameron, forking path narratives juxtapose alternative versions of a story, showing the possible outcomes that might result from small changes in a single event or group of events. These possible outcomes due to small changes are depicted in the Stanley Parable Deluxe. For example, if Stanley is going down a staircase instead of upwards, disobeying the narrator, it leads to him going insane and collapsing, instead of finding the mind control facility. Another small change would be bringing a reassurance bucket along to one ending and finding out the ending changes due to the bucket accompanying Stanley. For example, in the freedom ending, which happens if Stanley obeys the narrator's instructions all the time, the player shuts off the mind control facility and a big door slowly opens, through which Stanley can leave the building. If the bucket is brought to this ending, the door stops halfway through being opened and closes itself again, as the bucket, according to the narrator, cannot leave the office space. This leaves Stanley holding the bucket at the mind control facility, surrounded by darkness, until the game restarts itself. These small changes are also shown in 4321, as the reader can find out what might have happened in Archie's life if things had gone differently. For instance, if Archie does not get killed by a falling branch in summer camp. One of his best friends, Artie Featherman, dies due to a brain aneurysm in said summer camp instead. Considering the aforementioned points, I'm thinking that the Stanley Parable Deluxe is not just a time loop narrative or a forking paths narrative, but a combination of both future narrative types. The player knows the game always returns to Stanley standing alone in his office and tries to take a different path, which means the player is stuck in a time loop through the character of Stanley. But the character Stanley himself is in a forking paths narrative, as there is no indication Stanley is aware of being in a time loop. But those are only my thoughts. What do you think? And remember, the end is never the end, 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 is never the end.